Good evening, dear friends. I am very pleased to have you with us today. Today we are going to talk about the deep meaning of Egyptian civilization. In 1903, the outstanding French archaeologist Georges Legrand, as always, worked in Karnak. For several decades, this man saved Epithesut, the most perfect of places, as the ancient Egyptians called the national temple, the great temple of the god Amun-Ra, the temple of history to which every Egyptian king attributed his own leptos, whether it be pylons, columns, courtyards, colossi, or some other monuments. Working in front of the seventh pylon of the god Amun's temple, next to magnificent royal statues and walls covered with reliefs, he, going deeper and deeper to strengthen the foundations of the temple, finds the famous Karnak hiding place. 800 stone statues out of 17,000 bronze, wood and other materials, which despite the fairly moist soil of the temple, next to it was a sacred lake, were excellently preserved and immediately incredibly replenished the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Among these statues was the image that you see now on the screen, one of the early monuments of Karnak, which depicted the Tsar of Tutankhamun. A magnificent young image, almost piercing look. Despite the fact that the statue is made of stone, it is grey granite, compressed at the same time, spiky lips, the royal headscarf of Nemos on it, and, despite the damage to the king's forehead, still guessed Uri, the great sacred snake, which was for millennia in Egypt a symbol of the royal power. The whole Egyptian history can be as one axis string on the concept of the king, on the concept of the royal power. The king was the man or the god who united the world, the earthly world and the heavenly world. The king was the man or the god, I repeat myself for a reason, and correct. With the first day of his reign for Egypt began a new era. Ancient Egyptians did not know the duration of this period, and when the king ascended to the throne, the first day of the reign of the new king began. A new birth of the universe, a new world, a new history. The divine and the human were intertwined in the king of Egypt, because throughout its history, the Egyptians considered their ruler to be the one to whom both the human and the divine and many other aspects are connected together. Finally, it is important to emphasize that looking into the face of the kings of Egypt, we can learn more than we can learn about any other ruler of another country of antiquity. Because thanks to the Egyptian texts, thanks to the dry climate that preserves everything, including wigs, papyruses and fabrics, we often forget that we are looking into the 15th, 14th and sometimes into the 28th century BC and discuss the personal life of the kings, the events of their life and what surrounded them. In the era of Hellenism, when after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, a new dynasty of Ptolemies reigned in Egypt by the order of the first of them, Ptolemy of Soter, the Egyptian priest Mernejuti, who was in love with the god Thoth, as the name implies, by the order of the king, as you have already understood, began to make up the history of Egypt, the history of his country. In the ancient tradition, we know the name of this person as Manaphon. It was he who first divided the history of Egypt into 30 dynasties or 30 royal houses. These were great eras of prosperity, ancient, medieval, new dynasties. These were bloody and difficult periods between dynasties, as we often call them, transitional periods. But one way or another, going back to the tradition laid down by Manaphon, the full work of which unfortunately has not been preserved, we know quotes from this work from later ancient sources, we can trace the history of ancient Egypt, despite these incredible, not fitting in the human consciousness of the millennium, and learn the history of this great country in such distant times in more detail than we can talk about in many other cultures. Moreover, due to the fact that the ancient Egyptian poet was an extremely pedantic person, due to the many preserved texts, due to the volume of monuments of material culture that has come to our time, the Egyptian history, despite all its gaps, is so three-dimensional and so well known to us, both in terms of the continuity of the royal power and in terms of dating, despite the fact that, of course, all this is clarified with new findings that on the basis of the Egyptian history, gaps were built and clarified in the events of many other countries of the ancient Middle East, and traditionally in the archaeological layer of some city in Asia Minor, an Egyptian monument named after the Egyptian king gives us the opportunity to date the history of other cultures. The image of the pharaoh is unique, and moreover, we do not have a special title for one or another culture of the ancient world. The word pharaoh comes from the biblical text. It ascends to the title Pharaoh, the great house or palace, as the Tsar was often called. And together with the palace, looking into these faces, we see not only magnificence and not only detailed, amazing and interesting stories, but also, of course, grandiosity and unforgettableness, which have been mandatory components of the Egyptian royal power since ancient times. This colossus, which today as before sits in front of the grandiose colonnade of the temple of the god Amun in Luxor, is one of the magnificent images of the great Ramses. This is the 13th century BC. The Egyptians deified the colossus, considered it a living creature. Each of them, we will talk about it today in more detail, had its own name. Ra-in-Hiko, the son of the rulers, is the name of this royal statue. And then, looking into the Egyptian history, we will see a huge number of images, portraits, or more stylized images of the Tsars. But anyway, the pleas of the great rulers are really grandiose. Let's go back to the more ancient times. This is one of the first three-dimensional statues of the Egyptian ruler. The Tsar was called Necherihet, the divine flesh. In the future tradition, he received the epitaph Djoser, holy. It was for him that the great Zoki-Mahathep, in the beginning of the 27th century BC, built the first Egyptian step pyramid in the necropolis of Saqqara, 30 kilometers south of modern Cairo. It is covered with special festive clothing. It has a ritual beard. On top of the massive three-part wig, we see the headscarf for the first time. The very Nemes or Klaft, which you all know so well by Tutankhamun's mask. And the statue was richly painted. The eyes were once encrusted. Now look, we have the 27th century BC, the 14th century BC, the 13th century BC. But if we try to feel this panorama of time for a moment, which we are looking at today thanks to the Tsar's faces, I will probably show you two fair extreme points. On the right you can see the collection of the British Museum, the birch and ivory, which was found in the tomb, in the Abadovskaya tomb of Tsar Dan, the Tsar of the First Dynasty. That is the 29th century BC. Moreover, Dan was the first Tsar to receive the title of the Tsar of Upper and Lower Egypt. Despite the fact that there were rulers before him, they still fought for the unity of the Egyptian land. And here was the first ruler of the whole country. In the traditional pose, he beats the enemy's captive with a club. Next to him is his name. There is an amazing feature of the Egyptian Tsar's power. Of course, The symbolism and ideology of the Tsar's power changed over the course of thousands of years, depending on various circumstances, starting with the personality of the Tsar, ending with the era in which Egypt was at that time. But certain basic concepts, as well as the basic elements of the Tsar's power iconography, will remain the same. Here, Dan beats the enemy with a club. Thus, every Tsar for several thousand years will be portrayed as a triumphant defender of his country. On the left is a portrait of the last Egyptian Tsar, Nektanyam II, the 4th century BC. This is really a fantastic story because such a number of millennia filled with events and stories cannot be allowed by the faces of the rulers, probably not by any other ancient country in the Middle East. Naturally, the Egyptians, who are very pedantic about the world around them, about their own history, left behind what we call the Tsar's lists. In front of you is the wall of the temple of Seti I in Abydos. This is the famous Abydos Tsar's list. The figure on the far left is the Tsar Seti I himself. He raises his right hand in this characteristic gesture, which means a statement. He reads what is in front of him. In front of him is his little son, the future great Ramses. He opens a flower of papyrus in his hands. Then this flower of papyrus is unfolded on the wall, and you see several dozen names of the rulers. The first of them is framed in a green frame. Now it is written in this oval, as we often call it in Egyptology, the traditional oval in which the Tsar's name, it is not just an oval, it is an elongated sign of Shen, a sign of infinity, a sign of the orbit on which the solar disk moves around the universe. Everything is filled with magic, rituals, and sacred symbols. Therefore, even just this frame for the Tsar's name contains the desire for well-being, immortality, and eternal time for the name. The name should have existed forever. The Egyptian tradition of the name Menes, as the Greeks called him, attributed the foundation of the unified Egyptian throne. It is from him, according to this more ancient text and the works of Munafon, that the Egyptian history begins. Not only the Abydosian royal list, there are similar lists in other temples. At one time, the French brought a whole chamber of ancestors on the walls of which the names of the previous Tsars were inscribed in the reign of Tsar Thutmose III in the 15th century BC. Today, the chamber of ancestors can be seen in one of the halls of the Paris Louvre. When we can do it, we can definitely see it. There's a great Tutorinian royal canon in Turin, the papyrus scrolls, where there is also such a chronicle of the Egyptian reigns, and finally the most ancient Egyptian chronicle, the Palermo stone, which is kept in Palermo, Sicily. The chronicle of not only the names, but also the important events of the most ancient kings of the Egyptian land. Looking at the texts, we should not forget about other magnificent monuments which sometimes reflect the Egyptian concept of time. I really love this monument. It is extremely rare, and you will rarely see it. It is kept in the Museum of Mediterranean Archaeology in Marseille. There's a magnificent Egyptian collection which once belonged to Claude Bey, a French doctor who worked at the courts of the great Khedive Muhammad Ali. Here is the statue of Osiris, who sits on a pedestal. In front of the statue, his columns were worshipped as prayers. These are the spouses, husband and wife. His name was Amen-Vahsu, and hers was Hinu Tejibu. They were priests and priests of the late cult of Tsar Teti. Let's remember the date again. The monument was made approximately during the Tutankhamun period, that is in the 14th century BC. Tsar Teti ruled in the 24th century BC. The priests and objects of their cult are divided by millennia. In addition to the fact that the statue of Osiris was here, it is damaged. In addition to the fact that the statue of the goddess Ma'at, the goddess of truth, of the world order, of the heavenly law, according to which the earth exists, is depicted on the pedestal. There's another unique image on the side wall of the pedestal. Here is the priestess herself. She worships the spirit of Tsar Teti, who comes out of his own pyramids because, of course, the temple was pre-pyramidal. In Saqqara, the pyramid of Teti is well preserved. Here, for a second, think about the fact that the cult of one Tsar, and forgive me, Tsar Teti, is insignificant, existed for 1,000 years. This is an infinite number. Here is Snofru. You all know his father, Khufu, the great Cheops. During his reign, Snofru built 3 pyramids until his main monument became the so-called Red Pyramid in Dashur, which you see now in the upper corner of this frame. Snofru was a very successful Tsar. It was with him at the turn of the 27th and 26th centuries BC that the Sinai Peninsula was joined to Egypt. It was from this time that Sinai became Egyptian. For Egypt, this was very important because copper was mined on Sinai, the main metal, which later became the basis of various copper alloys and bronze. Malachite was also mined there. Great Mevkat was also mined there, the great sacred birch, dedicated to the mother goddess. He was a successful conqueror, a successful builder. If you collect 3 of his pyramids, you will understand that there are much more engineering work and even banal stones than in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Magnificent ships were built there, as we know from the chronicles of the Polar Stone. A successful Tsar, a prosperous Tsar. Moreover, a Tsar who opens the tradition of good Tsars to the memory of the ancient Egyptians. There are just Tsars and there are prosperous Tsars who correspond to the canonical idea of the ruler, which we conventionally call the Pharaoh. The cult of Snofru began during his lifetime. This is a fragment of his late stela, which stood in one of the pyramidal temples, now the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And the last known to us are the priests of Snofru. This is the 2nd century BC. 25 centuries, 2,500 years of the cult of one and the same Tsar, who, after his death, in all historical Egyptian sources, was revered as a good, perfect ruler of the Egyptian land. When an heir was born in the family, like in any other family, not only in the royal family, it was happiness, it was joy, especially since often in the Egyptian royal house, problems arose when it was necessary to transfer power through the elder princess when the boy's son failed. In front of you is a magnificent monument to the collection of the Brooklyn Museum in New York. This is the 23rd century BC. This is the great Queen Ankhnys Maria II, who holds on her knees her magnificent son Pepe II, who was the long-lived king. I'll pause for a second and remember that the Egyptians lived much less than we did. Diseases, all kinds of childhood problems, as well as all the other things that led to the fact that a person was already quite old. There is a rule of kings that is amazing. Pepe II became the most famous long-lived ruler of the ancient world. The fact is that he ruled for the first years, as you'll understand now, under the rule of the regency of the Mother Queen, and his first year correspond to the first year of his birth. There is the 98th year of Pepe II's rule. This is the most important long-lived ruler. This is an unprecedented figure for the ancient world. In the second place is Ramses the Great, who ruled for 67 years. Can you imagine? Taking into account the short life of an Egyptian, there were several generations of people for whom the king was really a god, because he was before them, he was after them, and this incredible succession of power in the person of one person had an incredible impact on the fact that it was incomparable with the real duration of a person's life. A child was, of course, expected. And from the moment of birth, this person, a person of sacred a priori, went through a series of rituals, the main of which, of course, was the coronation, which further strengthened the presence of the sacred inside the real body of the earthly baby. Here's a wonderful papyrus from the collection of the Berlin Museum. I think many of you remember these texts well. These are fairy tales told by Tsar Khufu to his sons. Without going into the details of this text, there is a lecture on fairy tales posted on the internet. I will remind you of only one element of this story, that Tsar Khufu is told that the sacred power should come from the sun god, and that soon his dynasty will end and the reign of the new sun kings will begin. And an amazingly beautiful legend is told that somewhere in the city of Sahbul there is a priest, Ra, a very small provincial town, and he has a wife, a noble Redzid, and God Ra chooses her as his earthly wife. She, of course, does not know about her destiny, and God Ra sends the supreme gods so that they, under the guise of musicians and acrobats who are going to perform at the neighbouring fair, take divine births from her. One of these days came. The Redzids began to fight. Her births were difficult, and the Majesty Ra, the great lord of Sahabul, said to Isidi, Neftidi, Meskanet, Tiket and Knumu, go and help Redzid get rid of the burden of 3 babies that she has in her womb, who will perform this charitable duty throughout this country. They will move you to temples, they will fill your altars with food, they will bring abundance to your tables for offerings, they will multiply your sacrifices. These gods went after they became dancers, and Knom, Nesha and Paklaju with them. They passed Redzid and locked themselves in a room, and Isidi sat in front of her, Neftidi behind her, and Heket accelerated the births. And then Isidi said, do not be strong in her womb, because your name is Usarev. And the baby slipped out into her arms, the baby in one elbow with strong elbows, his joints in gold, his headscarf made of real azurite. And they washed him after his butt was cut off and he was laid on a structure of bricks. And Meskhine approached him and said, here is the king who will rule the whole country. And Khnum gave his body naturally with each of the 3 babies who were actually real persons of the Tsars of the 5th dynasty. Each of the babies tells such a story. Here's a play of words. Do not be strong in her womb, because your name is Uzarev, because the term Uzarev means strong. Here's a play of words that implies that the goddess knows the secret name of the Tsar. The name of the Tsar will be a very important episode. We will talk about it a lot today. But from the very beginning, from here, from the papyrus of Baskar, we must imagine that the Egyptians, in very different ways, literary, temple magic, they showed the sacred nature of power. Power comes from the sun god. The sun god, in turn, is a visible form and particle of what they called Neberger, the lord of everything to the limit. That is, the eternal god of the creator. And the Tsar himself, they sometimes read as little sun. And this title also from time to time was included in the Tsar's title. The fact that the Tsar is little son can be said directly, and this idea can be transmitted through art. A magnificent monument, a Steely's image of Ramses II in his infancy, a collection of the Louvre. Let's look at it. There is a little boy sitting as a sign that he is very young. That is, he is not yet 5 years old. He has a shaved head, and on the side there's this huge specific band elbow. This is the elbow of youth. The Egyptians wore such an elbow in their childhood. The second gesture that shows that this is a baby, this is the finger on which he touches his lips. This is also a mandatory indicator of infancy in ancient Egypt. In fact, the title is already written here. The Tsar of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ruler of both lands, the throne name of the Tsar, which is given life, like Ra, in eternity and infinity. This is the whole text that is written here. I will talk a little later about the shape of the pillow on which the baby Ramses sits. These are two hills of the horizon. This is the hieroglyph Ahed, the horizon, and the Tsar sitting in the horizon is the sun, the most divine sun baby that is born from that world in this universe at the dawn of a new day. Everything related to the Tsar's infancy is, of course, an important part of the Tsar's house. There was a special person in the Tsar's house whose name was Itman, the father of the midwives. Under his command, great midwives served from all registers and classes. These midwives. You can imagine the eastern palace and the female half. At the same time, the father of the midwives is the head of this whole institution, a man who manages sometimes an incredible number of ladies. In addition to these first midwives, who naturally began to raise the baby together with the queen who gave birth to him, one of the queens, it is clear that the Tsar most often had several wives, the head of which was the great wife of the Tsar, above whom, according to the status, was the great mother of the Tsar. The mother headed the Tsar's female house, not the great wife. Naturally, in addition to all of them, people who were associated with the Tsar's education flourished because the Tsar was trained. The position of the Tsar's teacher in the court is very honourable, and this is a very high position of a nobleman. Here is a drawing from the tomb of a person whose name was Hekerni-He. He was the personal educator of the Tsar Thutmose IV in the 15th century BC. There is one very interesting detail. Let's take a closer look. Hekerni-He himself sits on such a luxurious throne. On his knees sits Thutmose IV, who is shown as a baby in height, but at the same time possesses all the instincts of an adult. His name is inscribed above him. He has the Tsar's scepters and the symbol of eternal life in his hands. The funniest thing is that this image was made in the last years of Hekerni-He's life. He was a successful teacher who successfully educated the Tsar, because the next small figure of the Tsar's son is the future Amenhotep III. In fact, Thutmose IV is depicted as his own son. He is already an adult, he's a pharaoh, but in relation to the teacher, there is a traditional proportion for the Egyptian canon in relation to the size of the figures. If Hekerni-He stands up and Thutmose IV also stands up, he will be shorter than his teacher. An additional detail that shows that he is a great Tsar is a special pedestal on which Thutmose IV's feet rest, depicting the captives and rulers of foreign lands whom the Tsar commands. We have quite a lot of tombs of farmers, of Tsar's teachers, and not necessarily tombs, but also sculptural images. The position was very revered, but nevertheless, from the very beginning, the whole story begins with the same attention to the birth of a real earthly child, as well as to the ideological elaboration of the sacred status that he should acquire. For the first time, this is what the Egyptian legend said in the papyrus of Vizcar, which I read to you. Here, in this room of the Luxor temple, the story received its further development. The main part of the Luxor temple was built by the son of Amenhotep in the 14th century BC for Amenhotep III, the famous Egyptian pharaoh of the sun, whose reign became one of the most brilliant in the history of ancient Egypt. And here is a separate side room of the temple, such a room that architecturally does not represent anything. And it was all covered with reliefs and was called Perms, or the house of birth. On the walls of this room there was a story about the divine marriage, as a result of which the king Amenhotep was born. This is what the divine marriage itself looks like. And this is a bed in the form of a sign of the sky. On the sign of the sky on the right is depicted Amun-Ra, the great ruler of the universe, the god of the sun. Next to him is his chosen one, the Egyptian queen. Two goddesses on the left, Selkit, and on the right, Nide, support their feet. In fact, there is complete harmony here, and this is actually a love union. This is the very beginning, which is very neatly shown by the Egyptian temple relief from which the story begins. The story is absolutely beautiful because once Amun-Ra decided to find an earthly wife, he sent the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love, to find the most beautiful one. But it so happened that the most beautiful turned out to be the great wife of the king Mutamuya, the wife of the king Tutmos IV. Then Amun-Ra came to her bedroom, taking the image of her lawful husband, and only by the incredible aroma of Ladan and Nira, which came from the body of God, did the great Mutamuya realize who was before her. From this marriage she began. At some point the god Tot appeared to her, the great messenger of the gods, the god of magic and letters, and he married her with good news, saying that she was pregnant with the Son of God. The story goes on about her birth and how the divine world, together with the earthly world, accepts this divine child. I will show several fragments. Despite the fact that the walls are poorly preserved, the images are distinguishable. Here in the centre of this picture is a potter's wheel. On the right is the god Khnum with the head of Ovna, the great heavenly potter. And he creates a man and his K on the potter's wheel from clay, his life force, his double K, which connects him with the world of ancestors. The goddess Kador holds the symbol of eternal life and puts it into life, into the non-living material body, so that later this child and his K would be born through Ovna Saritsa. In the next episode of Teogamy, I will show you drawings so that you do not suffer, looking at the hard, poorly preserved reliefs. In the 19th century, Richard Lepsius, the great German archaeologist, and his team perfectly documented the temple reliefs. They were in the best condition. So, the good news is already reported. Here, Khnum and the goddess Kador lead pregnant Saritsa Mutama to the great maternity bed. There is a giant maternity bed in the right part of this drawing, in the form of bed with lion heads. In the centre of the bed, there are two heavenly wreaths holding Tsaritsa in her arms. The moment of birth is not shown because it would pose a magical danger to her womb. Further in the upper register of the right half of the drawing, the goddess holds a baby, and over the baby the Tsar's name. This is the already born Tsar. The middle register, as well as the lower one, are various spirits carrying blessings for the protection of her baby. In the centre there are two figures in the middle row, with raised arms and with high leaves of phoenix palm fibre on their heads. This is the God of millions of years. There are various spirits behind him, but each of them holds an ankh, a symbol of eternal life, as a sign of their blessing to the Tsar. And the lower register is also very interesting. In the lower right corner of the drawing, there are two figures, Bes and Tort, keepers of the womb and the uterus. In the centre, there are massive signs of Sa and Uaz. Sa is a magical protection in the form of a knot, while Uaz is a sceptre of power. Finally, there are 6 figures depicted in a very funny pose. They are kneeling, hitting each other in the chest, and raising their arms in a fist. The faces of the first 3 figures are the faces of a falcon, and the next 3 are the faces of a jackal. These are the spirits of Pe Hen, the sacred spirits under which all the previous kings of the Egyptian land, whose names have already passed, whose names we do not remember, were worshipped. By the time of the birth of the queen, the son of the heir, the quintessence of the world of spirits takes place, which should give a safe birth and, of course, a safe reign to the newborn heir to the throne. Now, the next scene is very interesting. Here we see in the right part the falcon-headed god Hor bringing the baby and his Ka, which is depicted in the same way to the god Amun. This detail is very important because in the Egyptian daily ritual, when a woman gives birth to a child, this child is brought to the father, and if he takes him on his knees, he recognizes him. If he does not take him, he does not recognize him. Therefore, it is shown here in advance that the god Amun has already recognized this child. He holds him in his arms. Here again, the Nile spirits, the spirits of well-being, carry these babies. In the left corner of the drawing, there are 9 sacred entities that have divine standards, Ka and Nade, on their heads. These are the sources of life that will be necessary for the king. Remember about the royal life force. Today we will come to this more than once, and it will be important not only for the king, but also for ordinary people. The next scene. Let's start looking at it from the left. Amun sits on the throne. In front of him, as if already an adult, King Amenhotep III in the crown of the helmet of Kapresh. 2 goddesses from above and below bring him other crowns. On top of the crown, the red crown of Lower Egypt, of the northern regions of the country. On the bottom, another goddess brings a bottle-shaped white crown of Upper Egypt. Both parts of the kingdom will be under his power, and again the scene of healing. The same spirits of Pe and Nehen, in the form of figures with jackals and falcon heads, are here in the position of healing. God is with the head of Ibis, stretching the gesture in the already known position. In the middle of the speech, 9 gods are greeted. The great Divitaritsa, the great god of Karnak, he informs him of the birth of a new good son on earth and asks for protection for him. Finally, a few more fragments. We see different gods here, but I'm interested in the central scene. The goddess holds the king's baby in her hands and his hand. The high figure of the goddess is badly damaged by the relief with such a long vertical as if a cane in the head. Only partially the head is preserved. This is Sishat, the great goddess of letters and annals. We will see her in all details of her iconography today. In fact, she does not stretch her hand. She was holding a kalam, a cane stick, and the figure in front of her was holding a pot of water. This is the acquisition of the name and the writing of the king. in the annals of the living. There were lists of the living in the temples. Of course, the population was taken into account, not to mention the royal house. This practically did not come to our time, but she had to write down his name, and thus a new ruler. In general, the coronation of the element is clear that this is a very serious ritual. Moreover, sometimes the history of the birth of the king was recorded in great detail, who did not quite properly seize the throne. We will talk about this in a minute. They had to enter the sacred space by legitimate rulers. It was very important. But in addition to the ritual of entering the life, there is a coronation. I will tell you in 2 words. This is a huge ritual. At one time, our great Egyptologist Melitza Edwinovna Mathieu, in her book Ancient Egyptian Myths, detailed the ritual of the coronation. If you are interested, you'll find all the details in this book. Before you is the great Sphinx of Giza, but I am not interested in it now. Once there was a sanctuary of Setepet, a chosen sanctuary, and it is in this sanctuary that important rituals of the Egyptian king were held from the 2nd millennium. If we look at the preserved image, there are many episodes, and one of the most important episodes before you is the Wall of Ramesseum, the late temple of Ramses the Great. That is the 13th century BC. Let's see what is depicted here. The great Ashed, the great Perseus, is a sacred heraldic tree. At the foot of the tree, completely with insignia, with crowns, sits Ramses II. Behind him, on the throne, is depicted Atum, the god creator and god of the evening sun, who holds in his hands a kalam for a letter. On the opposite side, there are 2 figures already known to us, the goddess Seshat, the goddess of letters, and the headless one, her husband. They also hold in their hands a kalam for a letter. What do? According to legend, they write the new name of the new king on the leaves of the heraldic tree. Apparently, the great Perseus was also an element of legitimization of the Tsar's power from time to time, because in the 12th century BC, the Pharaoh Ramses IV took the throne, a legitimate heir, but before him there was an attempt of a coup d'etat. To prove once again that he was the legitimate son of the previous Tsar, he leaves an amazing inscription about how one day His Majesty Ramses IV comes to the temple of Ra in Heliopolis, and in one of the courtyards of the temple, the great Perseus is growing. He opens the door and suddenly he sees that the whole Perseus was covered with his throne names. So they entered the temple in a divine way, appeared on these petals, and everyone understood that he was the most legitimate Tsar of the earth. Although he was a legitimate heir, he needed to confirm his reign in this way. I can't help but pay attention to the elegance of the artist's work. Look at the hands, a fantastic performance of the fingers of the goddess Eshat. If you look closely, the turquoise malachite paint has been preserved. The relief was once brightly painted, and accordingly everything was bright, pompous, and very beautiful. Accordingly, all the texts about the reign, about the patronization of the ruler, are performed by words. They are written in a very oriental, pompous style. I will read a small fragment for you. All the earth rejoices, and there is nothing sad, for Amen established his son on his throne. The sun's course and his power is over the Asians and the Levites, those who plundered the goods of Egypt. There was a terrible land in danger since the time of the preceding kings. Both gods and people were left. There was no hero to unite them when they were in retreat. He appeared to a young man like Griffin, a bull ready for battle in the field, and the horses were like his falcons, and they growled like a terrible lion in anger. The warriors were powerful, like the god of war, Reshep. When they saw the same 10,000, he was like Mont, the god of war. His name is like a flame. Fear is in front of him in the land. The land of the Levites is gathered together, and the other tribes are also together. But the heart of his majesty was filled with power, like a terrible lion who threw himself on a sheep, and so on, and so on, and so on. This is a story about the triumphal victories that Ramses III in the 12th century after his reign. Yes, the world of gods, but the world of people is so alive, and human envy sometimes comes from the depths of the centuries in a shameful form. Because after Ramses II ruled for 67 years, as I have already told you, many other subsequent kings who also bore the name of Ramses, there were 11 Ramses. They really wanted such a term of rule, in particular the Pharaoh Ramses IV, the one who saw Perseus inscribed in the temple of Hera in Heliopolis. He left in Abydos in the temple of Osiris. A completely wonderful text. This is the royal ceremonial stele. You are double for me for a long time. The long reign of the king Ramses II, the great god, for the sake of great deeds and good deeds that I do in your house, to increase your divine offerings, to find everything beautiful, all the good, the sanctuary of your day, each of these 4 years, similar to those deeds that the king Ramses II, the great god, did for you in his 67 years. You are double for me for a long time. The long reign of the king Ramses II, the great god, for the sake of great deeds and good deeds that I do in your house, all the good, each of these 4 years, similar to those deeds that I do in your house, to increase your divine offerings, the long reign of the king Ramses II, the great god, for the sake of great deeds and good deeds that I do in your house, all the good, each of these 4 years, similar to those deeds, all the good, each of these 4 years that I do in your house, all the good, each of these 4 years, Ramses IV, delivered to us from the 12th to the new era. The important episode of the coronation was the fact that the king was grasping at the images of the gods. Of course, there was a huge clergy of the priests who were prepared for the ceremony in order for the gods to enter their bodies and crown the ruler through their earthly hands. If you look closely at this wonderful statue of the great Ramses of the Cairo Museum, you will see that he is crawling. There is such a box in front of him. He pushes his own name in the direction of the gods, which he received from his father and mother at birth, in order to get a 5-member royal title in exchange. At a certain time, there were 5 royal names, which were not just a list of names of the ruler. There was such a paradigm and a desire in them. What would you like from this king? How successful will he be? How great will he be? And all the same, this logic of the ancient heraldry, which existed in Egypt for many millennia, is emphasized here. Look at what the red arrow indicates. Do you see the leaves? He crawls along the branch, per se, to the trunk, to the gods who reside at its base, in order to receive the great by giving little. There is a very important thing here, which we will also return to today. Without giving, without sacrificing, you will not receive. And the conversation with the world of gods, which was once separated from the world of man, is built on the sacrifice and on the request for a gift in return. The king enters the temple. He and the choir water it with holy water. If you look closely, the holy water consists of the signs Ankh and Uaz. The looping Ankh is a symbol of eternal life. Uaz, in the form of a scepter, is a symbol of power and power. They enter the temple. In front of him, by the way, is not Anubis, but Upuot, the wolf head, the god who opens the way. Like the choir, they stretch to the king the breath of eternal life, Chayanank, the breath through which he receives life, which is depicted here with symbols. In front of them is the goddess Kador. She stretches her hands and her palms are depicted with hieroglyphs of water. And now welcome to the great ritual of entering the temple, where the king will become one of the equal after the coronation. Magnificent relief from Karnak with the image of Ramses II. Here is Montu, a very ancient Theban god of war. He is dressed according to the scheme. The literal translation is a double Silami. This is the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The united Lower Egypt is a pole with an arrow, and the Upper Egypt, which passes here, is a bottle-shaped form. The crown of Lower Egypt is red. The crown of Upper Egypt is bottle-shaped. It is white. And here, accordingly, Montu, as the incarnation of the ancient Theban land, carries out the element of coronation of the ruler. The crowns were considered living beings. In one of the legends, it is said that the god Geb, the god of the earth, being the heir to the son of the god Shu, the god of the air, once came to the heavenly palace when his father was not at home. His father was not at home, and the great royal crowns lay in his bedroom. He was a legal heir. This is very important. He decided to try it on, but sooner or later he would get it. But he had no sacred status. He did not go through the necessary rituals, and he did not sign a contract for his own reign. Therefore, when he took these crowns in his hands, a great Ured Hikou, a great goddess, which is depicted in the form of a cobra with a human face, and which is a symbol of all royal insignia, and in general only the intervention of his father, who, on the cry, returned home, saved the god of the earth from a painful death. Because she is aggressive, she is flaming, she is the guardian of the sacred power, and Ured Hikau is always revered as one of the most angry goddesses of the Egyptian pantheon. Now you see an amazing image. It was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. It is small, made of wood, covered with gold. And if you look closely at it, on the one hand, a cobra with a human face is depicted here, wearing a star of Sirius. What she has on her head is a sapadet, and she feeds the little King Tutankhamun with the breast of divine milk, who after that becomes the legal ruler. The connection between the king and the great goddess mother is emphasized in the Egyptian texts and images more than once. But there is one most important thing. Her milk is her life. The king drinks the milk of the goddess mother 3 times. At the time of birth, to gain material form. At the time of coronation, to gain a new status. The king is born again as a creature of dual nature, a divine human being. And at the time of death, in order to obtain a posthumous rebirth. The images of Ured Hikau, which are very often mentioned in the texts, are extremely rare, especially in such a complete iconography as this wonderful monument to the tomb of Tutankhamun. So how did the Egyptian ritual and the Egyptian theological thought connect the king to the divine human being? It's very simple. In addition to the fact that he was born a great queen mother, Sot Yagami was quickly remembered. When he sits on the throne of all living, he becomes a new incarnation of the god Hora, the great heavenly golden falcon, which is considered the founder of the Egyptian kings. He becomes a new Hora. He obtains these 5 new names as a new incarnation of Hora. That is why there is no prolonged summer solstice in Egypt. That is, a new form of horror comes, a new apostasy, and then the years of the reign of one or another king. And for example, for the Egyptians, especially before the era of the pyramids, for the ancient kingdom, there is no King Khufu. Khufu is his personal name. His relatives called him that, most likely. And for all the Egyptians, Hormizdu, a completely different name, because this name speaks of him as a golden falcon on this throne, as a new incarnation of Hora. In front of you is a magnificent monument. This is a legendary thing. This is the famous statue of King Hafra, which was found by Augustus Marietta in the late temple of this king at the second great pyramid of Giza. This is a magnificent green diorite with very beautiful veins. The king sits on the throne, but only from the side you can see his heavenly prototype, the sacred golden falcon which guards his head in such a gesture of protection. The fact is that in Egyptian art, throughout its development, throughout the development of Egyptian history, the relationship between the king and Hora, his heavenly prototype, changed. That is, there's a heavenly prototype, there is an earthly manifestation. But what is the status of one and what is the status of the other? Here is the great king, followed by a small heavenly bird. This is the 26th century BC. You remember everything, right? The 14th century BC, Horemheb, one of the successors of Tutankhamun, a magnificent monument and collection of the Museum of Art History in Vienna. Horemheb, Hora, is translated as the name of this king. Hora was his ancestral god, the god of his city. And here you see, in fact, almost the same height, two figures, both the heavenly Hora and his new earthly incarnation, the king Horemheb. And this is the 4th century BC. This is the second Neptune, a wonderful image kept in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. There is a difference between God and the king. And you know, there is no exaggeration here. This was exactly the position of the king in relation to the world of gods at one time or another. And despite the fact that the king is the king of the king, similar rituals, succession of power, all that I'm talking about. Let's recall for a second Hathor and the great pyramids and the living God on earth. And then Neptune too, which is practically incomparable in its status with the great heavenly falcon, the incarnation of which it is. The connection between the king and the falcon was emphasized since ancient times, and the first Egyptian inscriptions are, of course, inscriptions depicting the ruler's name. The magnificent tomb of Stela once stood in Obidos, next to the tomb of the king of the first dynasty, Jet. Today it is one of the masterpieces of the Louvre. If you look closely at the upper part of Stela, you will see the facade of the royal palace, which is called Serish. Further, as if in the courtyard, inside this courtyard there is a snake, and on the courtyard itself sits the falcon Hor. The hieroglyphic component that is present here inside the facade of the royal palace is the royal name Hor Jet Hor Snake. This is the king's name. Accordingly, from the name of the king, then from the titles of the king, and then from the names of the closest ones, then from the titles of the closest ones, a rich Egyptian polygraphy, a rich Egyptian literature, and in fact the Egyptian writing itself. It is from the name of Hor that the first royal name begins, the first of the 5. Now in front of us is a statue of Ramses II, and the yellow arrow points to the first column. There is an image of a falcon. Then behind the figure of a falcon is a sun disk, and then again the image of the royal palace with the courtyard, which we have just seen on a much more ancient monument. Inside this courtyard are the hieroglyphs of a bull, a hand with a rod, a rising horizon, an owl, and a reed feather. This is the first name that speaks of the king as of the great incarnation of Hor on earth. The second name is introduced by hieroglyphic signs of the female of the neck and the cobra. Cobra Wajid is the oldest goddess of the delta, patroness of northern Egypt. The female of the neck is Nibet, respectively, the heraldic patroness of the upper Egypt valley. Both the queen and the mother, and the name that opens with their figures, speaks of the king as of the ruler of upper and lower Egypt, to whom the great heraldic goddesses were given. These heraldic goddesses are very often seen in Egyptian art. On the right, the golden diadem of Ishid found on the mummy of Tutankhamun. You can see the cobra and the neck. On the relief of the temple in Abydos, you can see the king of Seti, two goddesses next to him. The iconographies are identical. You can attribute only by the inscriptions above them. On the left is the cobra, and on the right is Nehbet, the female of the neck, the great mother who takes the new ruler into her great dream. The third royal name is revealed by the figure of the falcon sitting on the sign of gold. On the one hand, the gold in Egypt is a symbol of immortality. On the other hand, the gold is a symbol of Kador, the great mother, the goddess of love. This name reveals the figure of the king as a creature who, like the gods, also has androgynous nature. He is worshipped by both male gods and goddesses. Therefore, the third name on this brick, which was covered with royal names and was buried under the foundation of one of the temples in order to illuminate the territory, the fourth and fifth names are already framed in these cartouches and these owls. Accordingly, the first name speaks of the king as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Usually it is the same throne name. Ramses II does not have Ramses II, Ramses III, Ramses I. Ramses I is Mount Petira. Ramses II is Sir Matros of Tepenra, and so on. In order to understand Ramses IV and Ramses IX, you should know all the throne names. You read the throne names on the statues, not the numbers invented by European researchers. Accordingly, Sir Matros of Tepenra is the throne name of Ramses II, and in most documents he will be mentioned in this way. Finally, the last and fifth name, which also associates the king as the son of the sun, is Ramses, loved by the god Amun. And if we combine all this madness together, we will get such a beautiful picture. The Turin coronation statue of Ramses the Great, one of the most famous monuments of Egyptian art, and then 5 kings' names. So, Horka Nacht Merima At, Horbik Maguchi, beloved by the truth. Then the second name, both rulers, Mekhemet Wafu Hasud, a protector of Egypt, supporting foreign countries. The third name, Hor Zolotoi, User Remputa Ananatu, great in years, strong even in years, great in victories. Then the one from the reed, the one from the bee, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, User Ma'atras Tepenra, Ra, strong, true, chosen for Ra. And the last name, the sign of the goose and the son of the sun, the son of Ra, Ra Mosumeriamon, Ra, born of him, beloved by the god Ammon. This is the official title of Ramses the Great, which is actually the second in all the books you will open. All the king's names are sacred, and this is in fact the program given by the king to the temple during the intronization. The names differ quite a lot. There are periods of calm, very typical king's names, and sometimes when something is connected with a war or overcoming a crisis. The names, titles, epithets show what was expected from the king after his reign. And the king's names, blessings, wishes, sacred symbols, as a result, in Egyptian art, become an important element of such an embroidered carpet. This is a very rare, very beautiful relief in the painting in front of you. This is Horemheb, one of the successors of Tutankhamun. He is carried in a palanquin during the holiday, with the trousers and feathers stuck in the head of the bearer as a sign that it is a holiday. Before the procession, there is a priest who holds a divine cigarette and smokes a laden in front of the king. This is a triumph. So in the far right corner of the frame, you can see the Nubian captives who are taken there during the procession. Behind all the figures, there is a king's apokalo bearer who holds a huge apokalo. On the other hand, apokalo bearers were very close to the king for one ritual reason. Chayanang, the breath of life. What is the breath transmitted by? By air. Therefore, an apokalo bearer is a mediator between the world of gods and the world of the king. There was a story in Egypt during the reign of one of the rulers, Ramses I, who ascended to the throne as the ruler of a new dynasty. He was an apokalo bearer during the reign of the previous king. He was higher than the king to God, and accordingly he has the right to his throne. If we look at the hieroglyphic signs, because the king's power is impossible without at least a minimal attraction of sacred texts, we will see in the yellow rectangle the God of good, the epitaph of the king as the little son. It is not written here that the king is not Horemheb, but Jeser Heper Urasit Epinra. This is the name of the throne. In the green rectangle, the ruler of both lands, Horemheb, beloved by Ammon. And then in the red rectangle, life is given to him like Ra in eternity. That is, even a simple mention of the king's name is here. And in a simple text, you just mention the king in a song. And here it is written that if you are not mentioned by the goddess Ahmed, you will be alive, healthy, and unharmed. This is a mandatory attribute to the king's name. That is, do not mention this state treason at all. And in fact, you imagine that every time you do not want, you write this. This is a magic message. You feed the king. You feed his health, his well-being, his immunity. Therefore, yes, he will be alive, unharmed and healthy. This is a mandatory attribute to the king's name. Another very important part of this image, it is now surrounded by a green rectangle. There is a banner on top with two raised hands. This is a symbol of K, a symbol of this king's vitality. And then, by the way, the king himself, Nessus, sees the plants, the hieroglyphs of bread tea, and the sign of water. The king's K is always present next to the king's person for one simple reason. The king is the leader of all living. His vitality is the total vitality of his people. And if the king is illegitimate, then his people will suffer from this first, because this is the breath of life that he receives from the gods. He passes it on to his people through his vitality. And if he does not breathe, then absolutely everyone starves in this sense. Therefore, for them, the illegitimacy of the ruler and these numerous attempts to legitimize power are associated with a completely practical idea that there is happiness in what was called the people of the black earth, the people of the Egyptian earth. In Egyptian art, there are several statues of famous kings. I will show you. The famous K of King Alabrashor of the end of the Middle Kingdom. This is the 18th century BC. A cedar tree encrusted, incredible eyes with a mountain quartz. And here is the famous K sign on his head. This is the sign of the circle that embraces the sky, because the second variation of the gesture K is the gesture of embracing. When you embrace a person, do you think who you are embracing? Because from the Egyptian point of view, you share vitality with this person and he is with you. This is more than an embrace. And accordingly, through K, from the world of ancestors, from this huge vitality of the gods, K gets the king and his subjects. The second K is very beautiful, and this is one of the two Ks found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. He does not have a K sign on his head. He is here in a ceremonial royal life wear, but the black colour of the skin conveys in fact not the natural colour of the king's skin, but black is a symbolic colour of immortality and eternal life, as well as green. The black earth is fertility, vitality. This is a great shot. The statue is now in London. The exhibition is being completed and the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is being stored there. Naturally, in addition to the name, in addition to the texts of good wishes, the king is always accompanied by a huge number of insignia, sacred symbols, crowns and robes. Let's look at this image. In front of you is Tutankhamun III. That is, it is the 15th century BC. In front of him is a very specific outfit of the Great Vizier. This is actually a scene of the appointment of the Great Vizier, who will be the supreme judge. The Great Vizier Chati, according to the ancient Egyptian, he is the supreme judge, the supreme star of the goddess Mat. Tutankhamun III, on him is an incredible crown of chine. I will not disassemble the crown now. You will not let me get away a little from this, because otherwise we will get stuck. But the green rectangle behind him is the figure of his Ka, his vital force. And in the sign of Ka, what do we see? Again, the facade of the royal palace on which the falcon sits. It says there, Ka Nachtha Em Uast, the mighty bull which shone in the fields, that is in his capital. And in his hands such an anthropomorphic image holds a specific banner and a feather of the goddess of truth, Mat. In the hands of the king, two main scepters, which he inherited from Osiris. These are two genuine scepters from the tomb of Tutankhamun. The scepter Heket, in the form of a hook, or Heka, is a symbol of magical power. This is a literal hieroglyphic of magical power. And the scepter Naihaha is such a long chain, but it has nothing to do. These are sunbeams that do not fall to the ground. These are the same scepters that Osiris once ruled the earth. And then the king, like Horus, that is the son of Osiris, and his legal heir, also holds these scepters. The royal name becomes the basis of Rebuse's elements of various Egyptian art. Very often, I will show a famous example. This is a stunningly small scepter from the tomb of Tutankhamun. Scorpion flies to the sunrise. This is the rising sun. Scorpion pushes the sun. Magnificent emerald with half precious stones and gold forms its wings. But I'm interested in something else. What do we see here? First, the beetle itself from the magnificent Badakhshan lazurite that the Egyptians brought from Afghanistan. That is, they brought gifts of trade caravans. The heart-shaped sun, 3 red lines, and a green basket. All these signs together are read as Neb-Hepru-Ra-Ra, the ruler of his creations. This is the throne name of Tutankhamun. That is, it is a brooch which also contains the king's name. Or such an example. This is a wonderful golden falcon that was part of a harness of the royal chariot. It stood on a long wooden stick, if I remember correctly, which connects the chariot and the horses. And here is a golden falcon. It has a huge solar disc, that is, an image of the god Ra, and inside this image is the throne name of Tutankhamun and additional signs of life that hang from the sun. There are 3 signs of life, and 3 in Egyptian writing is a plentiful number. That is such a life in all its aspects, a life in a cube, if I may say so, that is desired by the king here. The connection between the king and the sacred falcon was sometimes absolutely incredible. Let me show you another example, a very rare monument which unfortunately suffered a great deal during the Second World War. This statue is kept in Brussels in the Royal Museum of the History of Arts. It burned in a fire, then it was extinguished, and quartzite fell very heavily. Here is a male figure with a falcon mask, and behind it is a whole bird. There are inscriptions on the sides of the throne. It is mentioned that it was actually King Aben-Kateb III in the 14th century BC. And the fact is that from time to time on major state holidays, the king wore a golden garment of a sacred bird with a golden mask on his face. This is a rare sculptural image of the king during such a ceremony. Here, a little earlier, is an image of the king Thutmose IV, his father. You see, the king is walking and he is wearing a cape in the form of a bird's dress. Even whole sculptural monuments depict the king as a great golden bird. As you understand, it is the same thing that is kept in Manchester, and in the Peters Museum in London, the upper part of a similar monument is kept. The headdress and feathers of the golden falcon literally depict the king as a golden falcon on the ground. And now imagine Venkateb III, dressed in a golden garment of a sacred bird, walking along the processional colonnade of the Luxor temple in the clubs of the Laden Mira. This is an absolutely incredible sight. Egypt is incredibly beautiful and plentiful, and here is such a special representation of the king as God is. Well, concluding the topic of coronation, heraldica is present in it many times. A remarkable monument from the Cairo Museum. On the right is Ramses III, on the left is Hor, with the head of a falcon, which is associated with the delta, and on the other side is his eternal opposite, Set, with whom he always fights, which here represents the south. The south and the north, Set and Hor, crown the king, and in fact it is not even about the south and the north, but about the opposite. The king is so strong that he collects in himself what cannot be collected. There's a very deep meaning in this. The text of the sarcophagi, one of the very ancient Egyptian ritual texts, talks about the original times. And what were the original times when people were with the gods, when there was the golden age? And there were 2 more things. What are 2 things? Night and day, the sun and the moon, the earth and the sky, good and evil, hell and the great order, and Set, his distorted form. That is, in the king, human hope for the renewal of the world, for this repetition of the great universal cycle, and accordingly for the destruction of chaos which the king must do. From the insignia of the gods and royal titles, I will show you a picture of a slightly beautiful palace, that very Piraeus, that great house. I will make a reference. There is a large 2.5-hour lecture on the Tsar's palace. Who will be interested in this topic? There are many other details. Here I will briefly show. It was incredibly beautiful. Before you is a reconstruction of the hall of the palace of Tsar Ramses III Medine Abu. This is the 12th century BC. The columns are white, painted in blue, black, turquoise, and covered with golden tiles, palm-shaped capitals. The walls are white, but all the doorways, windows, and of course the central zone with the steps that rise to the Tsar's throne. It was all laid out with coloured faience and gold. And here, this coloured faience and gold against the background of white walls created, of course, an amazingly beautiful combination. In the centre there was a throne, the throne of all living. The throne, of course, was gold. And this is a wonderful work by the French architect and specialist in Egyptian art, Franco Meunier, on the basis of several illustrative sources, paintings, court paintings. This is how the throne of Amenhotep III was created. This is the 14th century BC. There are also a lot of heraldics here, because if you look closely at the capitals of the columns, the capitals of the inner columns in the form of a lily flower are the flowers of Upper Egypt. The outer columns are papyruses. These are the flowers of Lower Egypt. That is, everything here is subordinated to this incredible heraldic. And if we imagined how Amenhotep III sits on the throne during the reception, it would look like this. By the way, in front of you is a genuine painting of the 14th century in such a divine canopy. Amenhotep III is depicted together with his mother, Queen Mutmuyi, who once chose the goddess Kadkor as the most beautiful woman on earth. If we look at the lower tier of the image, we see all the peoples of the land that the Egyptian knows. They're all under the feet of the king and they all worship him. The most problematic peoples are the Nubians, the Syrians, that is, the real neighbours of the Egyptians. Geographically, they are on the platform, on the steps, because when the king goes, he stomps them. Moreover, under the feet of the royal statues are often depicted either such aliens or the image of 9 bows. 3 bows, we see the bow from which they shoot. 9 bows is a symbolic image of all the lands stomped by the feet of the Egyptian king, which are under the Egyptian rule. Therefore, on the one hand, it's very beautiful and decorative, and on the other hand, it's all state propaganda. And accordingly, they show the role of the Egyptian king as the earthly son. A few more works by Franco Meunier, because they are beautiful and immeasurable. These are his reconstructions of the Great Palace and Malkat. This is a summer residence of the 3rd Duchy of Manhattan in the south of Thebes. This is one of the halls of the palace. The central part of the ceiling was always made higher so that air flew into the windows, so that even on hot days it was cool here. Magnificent columns in the form of buds of water lilies, painted floors, walls. Everything is very beautiful here, and if this is a day shot, then this is how the palace looked in the evening hours and at night. In magnificent pieces of alabaster, conical bowls were carved from these pieces. A coloured relief was applied, a coloured image. Then it was inserted into the same bowl of a slightly larger size. And then, when oil was poured inside, an oil lamp was lit. The oil was highly purified from sesame oil. It practically did not smoke. We know this from chemical tests that were carried out on the remains of such oil and lamps from the tomb of Tutankhamun. Then, through the alabaster, some temple plots were also illuminated. Let's see how it looks. I think many of you know this beautiful monument. I especially take frames from the Gezi archive because they were illuminated here. They put lamps inside it. This is an Egyptian travertine, which we often incorrectly call alabaster. This is a travertine, a translucent stone. You see that when the lamp is lit, images are visible, which are applied to the outer side of the inner cone. Here is the Queen Anhizinamun bringing pieces of fabric to Tutankhamun. His names are illuminated. Imagine your imagination again. Go back to the frame for a second. Let's do it. There's nothing wrong with it. This is the palace. Such lamps are here. In order to finally finish everyone off, I will recall that in the residence of Merneptah in the 13th century in Memphis, in the central hall, the floors were made of plates of gold and silver that were associated with the days and nights of the king's travels. Now, do you understand why the Egyptian palaces in times of crisis, they were disassembled first? By the way, a lot of fragments. It was quite far from the settlements on the western bank of the Nile in the later times. Only on the basis of such fragments can such remarkable reconstructions be made. There is a lot to say about the life of the kings. There is a lot of material left. I will show you a few specific items to describe the personal life of the king a little. And this is a famous thing, but I can't pass by it. This is a famous cup of goodwill from the tomb of Tutankhamun. This is a travertine, a cup in the form of a flower dissolved in white water lily, buds on both sides. In the centre are the king's names and the text that says that the king is loved by Amun and Ra, the rulers of the thrones of the two lands, and the text that goes in two directions from the central sign of eternal life. Why goodwill? He says that the king is loved by Phoebus and that Phoebus wishes him happiness. He wishes him a northern wind for his nostrils. Imagine that the king Tutankhamun is sitting here. There's such images, drinking wine from such a cup, a northern wind, lamps are burning nearby, everything is very beautiful. And at the same time, how many shoots of plants do we have on the cup? 3. This is an image of the Theban triad. God Amun as a central sun, because the sun is born on the flowers of the water lily, and accordingly the buds are his wife Mut and his son Khonsu. And as a sign that the cycle will be permanent, who sits on the buds? The gods of millions of years. Each of them holds in his hands the hieroglyph Renapet, the fibre of a palm tree. The fibre of a palm tree ends with a headdress. The sign is 100,000. Under the headdress is a circle. This is Shen. This is infinity. 100,000 years of rule for this king, for this unchangeability of power, sacred in its essence. It is very touching and very interesting when we can touch the personal things of the king. On the right are the gloves of Tutankhamun for shooting from an arrow. Thin linen, woven, sewn, beauty is impossible. Again, I remind you that this is the 14th century before the new era, and due to the fact that Tutankhamun came to the throne as a 9-year-old child, as we know, they put toys in the tomb. And on the left, this is a wolf, which was also richly encrusted. This is a toy with which little Tutankhamun played at the court of Amarna, where he grew up. These are floors with incredible paintings. If here are beautiful images of Nile thickets from which ducks fly out, these are paintings of the floors of the palace of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in Amarna. Then sometimes, as it was in Malkatia, foreign rulers were depicted on the floors, which the king patted, walking along this painted carpet. There were never mosaic floors. In Egypt, there was always painting, and the painting was covered with a special varnish from a small cedar tree. Due to this, when the varnish dried, it was possible to walk on these floors. Not only secular rooms are known to us, but also private ones. This is a very rare frame. This is a reconstruction of Ramses II's resting place. All the walls were covered with images of Bes, the guardian spirit of evil spells. In one of the American museums, there's a fragment of a faience tile with the mask of Bes coming from the bedroom of Ramses II in the concierge in the first session. A very funny element of the bedroom. Pay attention to the fact that there is a bed far away. On the ceiling above the bed there is a strange curved semicircle. In fact, it is a catcher of the north wind. This is a hole in the ceiling above which, there was a natural roof. The bedroom was always oriented to the north. When the wind blows from the north, the catcher immediately lowers such an ancient air conditioner. He lowers the north wind directly to the royal bed. Speaking of the bedroom, why not show the wonderful sanitary inventions of the ancient Egyptians? The extreme left frame is about the image of a toilet from one of the high-rise houses in Akhet Atoni, Tamarna, which is kept in the Cairo Museum, and what you see on the right is the private shower of Ramses III in his palace complex in Medinet Abu. What did it look like? The king stood in this pallet through the wall that was higher than his height. He was watered with water, blagovon or something else. Then everything was poured into the shaft. There was also a sewage composed of vessels connected to each other. All this water went deep into the sand. Here, in the 12th century BC, His Majesty Ramses III took his bath, and all this is well preserved. The world of the Egyptian palace is the world of the nobles. A magnificent mask of one of them. He was apparently a contemporary of Tutankhamun. We do not know his name, but it is the 14th century BC. This is the main masterpiece of the Egyptian collection of the Brussels Museum. It is hard to describe it without a purpose, but looking at this mask, imagine a colossal pyramid. The wearers of this majesty's robe, the wearers of the king's sandals, the great king's manicurist and the great king's hairdresser, the wearers of food, the great wine grower, who more often, for example, in the heir of the New Kingdom, was a foreigner because he had a direct incentive to make sure that there was no poison, because he would immediately lose his position in another king. This is a huge pyramid, a mother, a nanny, ladies, men, a classic Eastern palace. The only very important thing is that it was never built in the Ottoman style. That is, there was no harem building. The woman's house is a combination of many palaces. That is, each lady had her own palace, depending on the status, but they were nevertheless a single economic structure, a single economic unit. Naturally, we have a king who must keep the mat, keep the great universal order. He must be a successful warrior. I will tell you quite a little about the war, but nevertheless, looking at this ostracon, a piece of limestone with a sketch of an artist who shows how Ramses III beats the foreigners. I hope you remember King Dan, the king of the first dynasty, who beat the enemies like that. Why hide the sin? The famous palette of Conor Meyer on the left, the Cairo Museum, the beginning of Egyptian history, the 30th century BC. This is probably one of the first images of the king of Upper Egypt, who, under the watchful eye of the goddess Bath, two female masks with the horns of a cow, the great mother, great grandmother, he beats his opponent. Further, if here we have this archaic, the heir to the Tsar of Nekhirahit, Djoser, King Sekhmet, on the rocks of the Sinai Peninsula. These are rocks. Sinai was already then not fully joined. In exactly the same position, he beats the enemy. With some kings, not just a part of such ideology, there was a war, but quite a part of real actions. I will tell you about one. This is a completely unique king. This is the SSR3, the 18th century BC, incredible portraits. This is the meeting of Calouste Gulbenkian in Lisbon. This is obsidian, this is volcanic glass. The king was both a warrior and an intellectual at the same time. Special expeditions went to Nubia in order to calculate the Nile flood, because a good Nile flood with 16 elbows, that is 8 meters, is good luck, because the fields will be full of water, but they will not wash away the upper villages. If the flood is higher, then this is a tragedy. If it is low, then the water will not reach the upper fields. This is a famine. As a result, to adapt to the volume of water in Egypt to the third threshold of the Nile in Sudan, here is a reconstruction of the An-Neba fortress. This is the ancient capital of Nubia. And here, on the one hand, we have a magnificent fortification, because Nubia was traditionally an unstable land. Egypt needed it because it is not only it is gold. It is all the gifts of tropical Africa. That is, it is a colossal economic component of the Egyptian state. But my sadness is that most of the fortresses came to us until the 1950s, and they were all flooded with the waters of the Nile during the construction of the High Swan Dam. Buchan, Mergis, Uranarti, Derganarti, a huge number of these fortresses, and all of them were founded by Nasser III. He was an absolutely incredible, as they would say now, successful administrator and a very successful warrior. He suppressed separate uprisings very hard, because especially the Nubians, archers, at certain times, they strongly opposed the Egyptian rule. He overthrew them all in order for the Egyptian warships to cross the Nile, and it was very difficult to carry the ship across the threshold. Channels were made, but not with water. They were filled with silt. The silt was watered, and the ships were dragging the silt with great speed across the threshold in order to pass the natural river barriers. These channels were preserved in the area of the first and second thresholds of the Nile. And it is amazing, in the area of the second threshold of the Nile, there are already hundreds of thousands of footprints of men's feet. That is, these are the feet of the ancient Egyptians who were dragging the ships at the last moment. He was a successful king, and to be honest, having drowned Nubia in blood, he became a holy patron of the southern lands, who was revered there for many centuries by subsequent kings. Here we meet the 15th century before the new era, a great conqueror, more than 360 cities. The Egyptian Empire, we conventionally use this word for this period, it extended from Nahrain, that is from southern Turkey, to Karui, to the third threshold of the Nile in present-day Sudan, a grandiose kingdom which was provided by fortresses, governors, garrisons, and so on. This is a fragment of the relief on one of the pylons of Karnak. You see it all in the same pose, beating up. This is a joke. Sometimes Egyptologists call it parsley. This is a bunch of foreign rulers who he beats in front of the god Amun, Ramses the Great. The 13th century before the new era. To be honest, he was not a very successful warrior, but the propaganda was incredible, so it declared him very successful. The same way he beats a bunch of enemies in front of the statue of the god Amun on the relief of his temple in Abu Simbel. In Egyptian art and in Egyptian royal ideology, the captured lands were depicted as captured in the literal sense of the word. And here on this relief, you see an image of a fortress with such bastions. From the fortress, a figure of an African captive stands out on the waist. We see that this is a Negroid. His hands are tied from behind. Moreover, the lily of Upper Egypt, that is, his breathing depends on whether he is allowed to breathe. And what he has inside this oval, the loop, is UA. The image of a predatory bird is A and T, a swan at the end. This is the central Nubia. This is a specific geographical location, and it is one of a number, as you can see, of such captives. In one of the rooms of Amun's temple in Karnak, in the presence of the third, a passage was made. Now it is not very well preserved. On the southern side you have all the Nubian lands like this on a rope, and on the northern side everything is geographically connected, all Asian peoples. This is the official Egyptian propaganda that Egypt is a mat. Everything else is a distorted world. This is a hypocrisy. When the Egyptians arrived in some new lands, they re-enlightened the new land that became part of their world. And this is the image of Ashkelon, the prime minister of Neptah, with the son of Ramses II. You can see the fortress here. The Egyptian warrior breaks the door and everyone asks for mercy for the huge figure of the king, which was also depicted on this relief. A part of the successful king of the warrior is hunting. There's a large number of successful bright kings, and there are many mentions of lion hunting in the desert. And one of the venerable kings says that he never hunted any lions in the holy days of the goddess Bastet, because she, like a lioness and a cat, protected them. What you see now is a fragment of a case for Tutankhamun's bow. Here is a wonderful scene where the king is riding a chariot, shooting his dogs from the bow. By the way, Tutankhamun basically had favourite dogs because he always had a dog in his childhood images. And in many other images, the favourite dogs are found more often than in other kings. This is always the production of fragments of the royal plough. This is the central part where the ostrich feathers were inserted. And here are the ostriches brought by the servants to their master in hunting. There was always a sacred subtext, a wonderful statue of Tutankhamun on a chalice. If we take a closer look at it, it is such a simple reed chalice, of which there were many in the low thickets. The king stands on it. He has a harpoon in his hands and a copper wire in the other hand. The king again becomes the choir, the great supporter of chaos. Chaos in this case unites Seth. Accordingly, it is a hippopotamus that swims in the low waters. Chaos is not visible here. He cannot be depicted. And like a choir, the king must stick a harpoon, beat the hippopotamus, and thus seize the forces of chaos. Hunting for a hippopotamus was customary in the royal house, but in those images in the tombs of the noblemen, there's always a huge nobleman, a huge overgrowth, and a small hippopotamus, because he must be, from a magical point of view, vulnerable and pitiful in relation to the great fighter who establishes the truth. And of course, all these elements of royal propaganda, military ones, are always depicted on the outer walls of the temple, because they also protect the temple from any forces of chaos. The magnificent pylon of the temple of the god Hora in Edfu. Look at it from both sides. You see the image of the royal figure. This is Ptolemy the 12th. This is the father of Cleopatra. This is the father of Cleopatra, who stands in his 2nd century before the new era, even the 1st century before the new era, and he is in the same position as Narmericus. Nothing has changed in its essence, although of course he is already a Greek Roman ruler, a person who did not know the Egyptian language. The second task of the king, as the one who should bring the mat into the universe, is the construction of temples. Ramses is a mighty king, raising monuments in the house of his father Ammon, creating his house in eternity and infinity. So the king bent his heart to the construction of monuments. Whether in a dream or awake, he did not stop thinking about the creation of beautiful things. This His Majesty gave orders and led the work. All his intentions were carried out immediately, like his father, the god Ptah, to whom he is like in the magnificence of the creation of beautiful things, created in beauty and forever. All the countries are at your feet, O king ruler of the 9 arches, the ruler of both lands, Ramses. He raised it for his father, Amun-Ra, the ruler of the Epiphany. He built a temple of the spirit of Ramses in the world of Amun, in the house of Amun, drunk from the court. This is how Karnak's bed was called in the 13th century in ancient times. He built from white sandstone the place of inspiration of the king of the gods, a beautiful refuge for the divine 9 arches, surrounded by columns. The walls are like 2 mountains to him, reaching the beauty of his height in heaven. Ammon says, look, gods, here is this beautiful, pure and strong temple that my son, in love with my flesh, King Ramses, raised for me. I gave birth to it to create something beautiful for my house. I created it, like my members, to celebrate the coming of my king. You, gods, must reward it with life and peace. You must create its future and make it similar among you, and it will be a spirit like you, spirits, and it will be a god like you, gods, and its name will flourish as your names flourish until the end of time and forever. For what he created in Karnak, says Ramses, I created it for you with a loving heart, like a caring son for his father. May the good God, raising the temple for his father, this is an element of the triumphal text of Ramses II, which he built incredibly. In fact, it was not he who started it, it was Zochimiah with Tutankhamun. Accordingly, several kings built it. But the great house of the exaltation of the spirit of Amun arose with it, 134 columns. Let me remind you that the territory of the hypostyle hall in Karnak, which is one of the halls of the temple, is freely accommodated by the whole cathedral of St. Peter in Rome. The whole central colonnade is 21.5 metres. The side nephi are 16 metres, and the difference between the nephi of the window through which the light passed into this space, most of which was not just painted but decorated with gold. And all these columns and their forms recreate the legend of Abid about the great pre-eternal swamps where the sun is born and peace is created. Therefore, all the side limits of the hall are not a created world, but a central nephi with scattered papyruses and illuminated by the sun. This is the creation. Here it is, the world created again by Ramses, who is the legal heir of the world, the gods. On one of the walls of the hypostyle, a wonderful relief. Ramses stands in front of the sanctuary. He lights a candle inside the sanctuary of his heavenly parents, the god Amun and his wife, the goddess Mut, who embraces in such an amazing, touching embrace her husband, the great heavenly ruler. Worship in Egypt is possible only on behalf of the king. This is a very important thing. It is clear that the king cannot serve in all the temples of Egypt at the same time, but the high priest receives permission from the king to be the deputy of the king during the worship. Because every worship is built on a very complex and simple principle. The task is to make at the time of worship the spirits of the gods go to their cult statues. Time is zeroed. Time is like the worst enemy of man and gods, and the altar becomes the place that is similar to the original hill of the land created by the deity. This is a constant machine for the renewal of the world. The magnificent relief of Isobedos, the father of Ramses II, is now in front of us. He holds in his hands the figure of the goddess Moad, at the goddess of truth. In front of him, Naus and the sacred Osiris, Isis and Horus, the great triad of Obidos. What is now highlighted by two vertical green rectangles is the gift of truth, the ruler of truth. And that is, he gives the truth to where it comes from. And then, if you look at the horizontal rectangle, you'll see that the foundation of the throne of Osiris has such a slope in front. This is not a platform at all. This is in the profile depicted as the foundation of the throne, the hieroglyph of the goddess of Moad. He is the one who is the peace on the truth. The task is very simple. Modus too. Very often, by the way, people ask the question why there are two truths in Egypt. Because one is earthly, the other is heavenly. And if the king is righteous, if the world is prosperous, if everything is good, if the ritual is performed, then when he gives Moad, the earthly Moad connects with the heavenly Moad in an eternal resonance. And it is inside this heavenly resonance that the divine spirits enter the cult statues. The image of the principle of Moad is absolutely permeating for the Egyptian culture. Now let me remind you of three levels. The cosmic level: sunrise, sunset, moon, moon, stars, rhythm of the Nile. This is all the cosmic level of Moad. The level of the earth: law, public rules, norms. It is the great lady of justice. And the personal level is righteousness, sincerity, purity of heart, following the law. And accordingly, this principle of sacrificing the truth, the Lord of the truth, is the basis of worship. And in general, this is a special ritual. When the doors of the golden house open, the statue is ennobled, new clothes are put on it, sacrifices are made, they play on the great arches, smoke with great incense. Traditionally, yes, or Seneca, what makes it divine is Ladan, or Antio is Nera. And then, when the worship is over, the king of his seal seals the golden house, and he hides from the house, and the whole floor of the sanctuary is covered with manually selected large sand, and he, with a special golden broom, covers his own footprints in front of him, so that it would be seen further that no one touched the shrine, no one touched the divine statue. You can guess that in fact everything is in order, more complicated. And for each action, another 10 actions, we know a lot. More we do not know, of course, but nevertheless, this is the basis of Egyptian worship. In fact, there is also a magic message. Here is this amazing shot. This is one of the sanctuaries of Abydos. This is the sanctuary of Isis in the temple of St. Peter. And let's look at the logic. The king, everywhere, every scene. And what does the king do? He smokes incense, he pours water, he brings gifts. What does he do? There is a goddess in front of him everywhere, and everywhere there is a commenting text. And then a very interesting thing happens. The text writes that I, the conditional king, am the first in the world. I give you a great goddess, that. And she says in response, I give you that. And if the worship is successful and the spirit of the goddess entered the cult statue, then it does not only enter the cult statue, but into each of its images. And at this moment, what is written becomes reality, materializes, and thus all the good wishes take on their material form and enter this world. And all this is the great grace that comes from the temple. One of the fragments of this relief in front of you is a magnificent golden flesh of the goddess Isis, and the king holds a sacrificial lamb. What was in the sacrifice? Various varieties of bread, up to 17 types, various varieties of beer, meat of domestic and wild animals, various birds, fruits, mainly pomegranates, grapes, figs, vegetables, onions, garlic, what the Egyptians called bedukau. Bedukau is all beach. Zucchini, watermelons. They knew watermelons, by the way. All that is grown on beach is bedukau. Honey, milk and wine, oil and incense, lamps and wicks separately to them, fabric, wax, salt and natron, a natural mixture of soda and salt that was used for cleansing ceremonies, all royal insignia, jewellery and elements of the costume that could be offered to the goddess, and you can imagine how rich it was. Naturally, after the service, the sacrificial gifts were sorted out. Something was eaten by the priests, something was donated from the temple to the poor. That is, it was the basis of a large economic model, the head of which was each temple. But by making sacrifices, the Tsar ascended to a very important principle that we must understand. For a second, let's remember the legend of Osiris and Osiris. Osiris was killed by his brother Seth, his son, born in Sydney. Hor must revive his father. And Seth is already defeated, and Osiris's body is collected from pieces. Everything has already been done. Osiris is not reborn. Then Hor takes his own eye, which during the battle he tore from Seth and lets him swallow his father. And due to the fact that the eye was the biggest victim, a piece of flesh, he tore from himself, which is possible. Then by swallowing Hor's eye, Osiris begins to be reborn to eternal life. Before you is a magnificent Hor's eye. This is a suspension of the pectoralis of Tutankhamun's tomb. By the way, again, Gerald, Snake, Wajid, North and Nibet, South are here. And as a result, the main sacrificial formulas are very interesting. When the Tsar says, I give you, O great God, saffron, incense, like Hor's eye, I give you fruit and bread, meat, like Hor's eye, as the biggest victim, which is possible in principle. Because in fact, in the process of sacrifice, one very important task is solved. There is God. He created the earth. Bread grew on the earth. Bread is eaten. A loaf is baked. And when the Tsar brings a loaf to God, he sacrifices God to God. And here the question arises, what is a sacrifice? This is a material sacrifice. In the Egyptian text, it is presented as a material body of the spiritual message. He sacrifices the impulse of the heart. He sacrifices the lamp, which is a symbol of his soul. He sacrifices the figure of the goddess Mat, because God does not need bread. He created it himself. But what is put into this bread? This is a sacrifice, because it makes no sense. And in a huge number of ritual texts, Egypt brilliantly discusses this ethic of sacrifice. So what does God get from a person? He gets this very divine message. Well, among the sacrifices, there are often various elements in Egypt that symbolize chaos. Chaos needs to be corrected. In Abydos, this is already a relief of Ramses II, the procession of the gods who hold a net behind the rope, and the net is thrown into the swamp in which there is a sea of birds. These ducks are a symbol of chaos, and literally the next relief, which continues this composition, you see here Ramses II and his heir, Prince Amenhotep, who hold what in their hands? Ducks. And these ducks they bring to Amen and Mut. Ducks, a terrible red bull, which symbolises the net. Probably the most interesting images, you will understand why. Oryx, a desert antelope. A desert antelope which is caught, in which the idea of evil and great chaos is embedded, which is sacrificed. Well, that very goat, the release of later religious forms, which actually comes from the ritual of the Egyptian god Socrates, the god of death. This all also comes to Egypt. Yes, sometimes the image of the captives. Egypt is very peaceful. They, in the rarest cases, never sacrificed a person. The last sacrifice is known. This is the 28th century BC. This is the second dynasty. Very rarely in the kilns of the great mother goddess, they burn the oath of criminals or some harmful characters. But these are the rarest cases in the entire Egyptian history. In general, they are very peaceful and there were no human sacrifices. But we have two ideas about two forms of time in Egypt. One time is our nehek. This is infinity. The sun rotates, sunrise, sunset. This is a changing time. And there is a time of the afterlife jet, eternity, where everything is inexplicable. And if we want to somehow simplify our world, then we need to bring as much of eternity as possible into our variability. Therefore, among the sacrificial gifts of the kings, very often the king gives an image of himself making a sacrifice. Because from the point of view of eternity, this statue always brings a sacrifice. And when we see numerous statues of kings or nobles in whose hands is some kind of sacrifice, this is essentially not just a statue depicted, but it is a magical action embodied in the stone on the constant feeding of the new world. A fragment of the relief from the Luxor temple is now in front of us. Tsar Amenhotep III is depicted in the image of a sphinx holding a vessel with holy oil. The shape indicates the content. And a little further, his name is Nebmatra, signed in the form of such a kneeling figure, which also sacrifices oil. Well, and of course there's always a blessing with the first sacrifice of Moses and Zabidos, and in his hands is a cigarette lighter. It was called Asatesh, a genuine Egyptian cigarette lighter from the Cairo Museum of Nij. It was believed that it was the elbow of the god Hora, that it was literally the hand of Hora, and in the centre, in the cup that holds the king's figure, were the grains of ladan. Ladan was not brewed, it was a real resin of ladan wood. In the cup that stands on the open palm, there were coals, and the king pours ladan on the coals and exalts him o'er the world before the great gods during worship. Accordingly, a successful king is the king who gave a lot to the gods, when he, in addition to the god of the god, gave what his land could bring. But in return, the gods also give a lot. The relief depicts the god Ammon, who kisses Tutmos III, his legal earthly son. What are the gifts of the gods? What do the gods give in return? All the components of life that is life, indomitability, strength, health, and a very beautiful term, Al-Tib, eternity of the heart. This is such happiness in its highest form. They give power to the king over all the countries. They give him the possession of Kemet Disheret, the black land, the red land, that is the Nile Valley and the desert. South and north give him power. They give him a double crown. They give him the power to rule. Moreover, there are 4 types of different powers and how to rule the land. I will not go into this now, otherwise we will stay here for the night. Indomitability over the 9 arches. Many holidays have said, holidays of renewal of vitality. A very interesting gift, Yaut in Atum. This is the throne of Atum, the eternal throne, that is not even the throne, but the eternal gods, showing what a worthy heir he is. The lifetime of Ra, the years of Atum, millions of years of rule. Moreover, it can also be such a rule that lasts. This is probably the dream of many in our world. While the sky exists, while the earth lasts, there is your power. This is a direct quote. Or here's another beautiful one. Your name is as strong as the sky. Your monuments exist forever. And finally, at the end of this list, absolutely different, there are 5 different categories of the gift of the earth. That is the gift of fertility. That is, the earth will be fertile, successful, but it is always in the last place. Everything that I listed from the point of view of the importance among the gifts of the gods. I will very quickly show several great monuments. They all reflect the same idea. Power is not just sacred, power is protected. The Luxor Museum, the god Ammon holds his palms behind the back of the King Horemheba in honour of Setepsa, the establishment of magical protection. That is, it is a god who protects his son-in-law. And the king is depicted of the same height with the gods and goddesses. Here is the king, Thutmose I. He is the left in this triad from Karnak, which is kept in Cairo. He is equal to the gods here. I cannot help but show two reliefs of Zabidos, because the beauty is impossible. The god of the moon, Khonsu, gives the nostrils, that is, the breath of Setepsa the first. Inside this breath is a sign of life and two signs of power. Another Zabidos, because it's also impossible not to show. Asida holds on his knees Setepsa as his own baby. There are myriads of hieroglyphic texts that tell what the king will get in return. Another very important thing, after all, in relation to the king of the gods, they are his ancestors. Therefore, in special rituals, it is emphasized that the king, for example, here he such a special gesture, showing his little finger, he ennobles with incense the statue of the god Osiris, bringing gifts, recalling the names of the ancestors. He feeds Ahu, he also feeds the spirits of the ancestors. In return, the ancestors give the living generations vitality, because this vitality of K and the vitality of the king is the power of life of many generations, from the generation of the deceased to the generations of the future. In the church, the king is present not only in the images, but also in the form of a colossus. In Turin, the Egyptian museum, there's a large hall of sculpture. In order to drag this statue of Setepsa II from Karnak into the museum, part of the museum wall was dismantled at the Via dell'Accademia in Turin because no entrance could withstand it. I will show you different colossi, also magnificent works of this beautiful architect, Franco Munier. The blue arrow shows the Colossus of Ramses the Great, the fallen Colossus of Mazema. You see different, quite specific statues from different temples in Egypt. The height of a decent Colossus is from 10 metres, closer to 20, and this Colossus, the 120-metre Amenhotep III, once stood courtside, incredible, in front of the 10th pylon of the Luxor temple. Now it has a pedestal, legs, and a huge number of fragments. These are the legs, meaning that this is taken from the height of my height. Further on the pedestal, 20 metres, and it looked like this. And of course, inside the space of the royal colossal sculpture, again, a sea of symbols, the Luxor Colossi of Ramses. Each leg has a beloved wife, Nefertari, or one of the other wives, who had a very high status in relation to the king. And finally, on the side of the throne, two Nile spirits, two Hapi, tied together lily and papyrus, Upper and Lower Egypt, around the sign of the trachea of the lungs. When the Upper and Lower Egypt are connected, then the breath of life passes inside the heart and the country is alive. The royal colossi were objects of worship in the Roma Museum of the Hildesheim epilepsy. This wonderful relief is still preserved. In the upper part, firstly, Ramses brings a figure of the goddess Man to the god Ptah, and then a window of phenomena. What is it? At the height of the second floor there was a window decorated with gold and precious materials. On the balcony, leaning on a pillow, the king appeared, and then a particular nobleman who made this stela actually left in eternity a memory of how the king rewarded him. because from there rings, bracelets, orders were simply thrown with the gold of this person. And in the lower part, standing next to his colossus, and Ramses sacrifices a sea of gifts to this character. I already said that the colossi were perceived as living creatures. Well, another stela with the royal colossus, and a note that there are 4 ears behind the colossus. And if you study Egyptian art carefully, you know that royal images often have very large ears. They are made so that the king hears the prayer. After all, he is a great mediator between this world and another. Why 4? Not because the king has 4 ears, but because there are 4 sides of the world, and no matter which side of the world, the prayer would not reach the ears of the king. Here is such a divine colossus. Here, by the way, his name is written Hikaim Hikau. The ruler of the rulers was called the statue. These are all specific statues that once stood in different temples of Egypt. And here Ramses honours his own statue. There was a lot of self-deification in the cult of many Egyptian kings. And this statue is kept in the Luxor Museum. It was found under the floors of the Luxor temple. This is the divine Menhotep III. He worshipped his own statue. Moreover, if you look closely, the statue stands on the slats, and the slats in the profile are the hieroglyphs TEM. It is the name of the god Atum. That is, it is both iconographic and textual through such a rebus that he identifies with the evening sun and worships himself. It is very interesting that many parts of the statue, for example bracelets, suspension on the chest, it seems that they are unfinished. In fact, this is not so. The statue is made of quartzite. It is also sparkly. It does not transmit any frame. And where this matte surface is, this is the surface of gold plating. It was all covered with gold. That is, it had a golden hip band, bracelets, crown. The crown of Lower Egypt was also covered with gold. That is, the monument was incredible. Well, and probably only Ramses II Abu Simbel, a colossus 21 metres high, above the entrance, a rebus that makes up the royal name of Osir Matra, and in the sanctuary, on the right and on the left, the god of the sun, Ramses himself, the god Amun and the god Ptah, who always remains in the dark as the god of the sacred powers of the earth. That is, he sits in the sanctuary among the 4 gods. In his own temple in Abydos, Ramses is depicted as a god on a sunbed, and he has this horn around his ear. This is the horn of the highest divinity. It is this horn of the highest divinity that will later enter the iconography of Alexander the Great after his Egyptian coronation. Where did Alexander the Great come from? In fact, this symbol was known long before him, the 13th century BC. A small element of the king's iconography, but an important one, is the Sphinx, because Shesheb Ankh, a living image, connects the king with the sun god. Of course, the magnificent Sphinx of Amenhotep III from St. Petersburg, the University Embankment, and the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, a piece of the throne, an armrest with an image depicting the Sphinx attacking the enemies of the Egyptian state. Look at this. This is a very simple monument. The British Museum is a Sphinx tearing the aliens apart. It is very vividly executed for Egyptian art. Here, he literally tears the body apart with his clothes. The Sphinx is another symbol of the king as the sun god. You can stay in the temple as an inscription. You can stay as a colossus. You can stay as an obelisk. The obelisk is a very ancient sun symbol. As you remember, a huge number of obelisks were exported to Rome. I think there were 17 obelisks in Rome, Caligula exported obelisks very actively and many other Roman emperors, but I'm interested in something else. This is Karnak, the obelisk to the right of Thutmose I. That is the 16th century BC. The obelisk of his daughter, the Pharaoh's wife, Hatshepsut. Initially they were not paired. There were two obelisks of Thutmose I and then two obelisks of Hatshepsut. The left obelisk of Hatshepsut is much further away from the first obelisk. The obelisks are always inscribed with the title and the names of the glorious king. And this is what is written in the fragment that I'm showing you. He created as monuments for his father Amun-Ra, who's the leader of the two lands. He erected two great obelisks. I'm interested in the word in the red rectangle, menu. I translated it as monuments, but this is actually a conditional translation that is understandable in European languages. What is a menu? A menu is your creation as possible for you at this moment. That is, if you can order a menu to Amun-Ra to the extent of your ability, then it is a menu. But if you are a beggar and you have a pot of water or a cow made of dough, there is no other. And you brought it, but you really have nothing else. This is also a menu. This idea of the highest gift that you can make in the world of gods makes the Egyptian texts of creation incredibly multifaceted. And this term in the menu, in the interaction between God and king, plays a very important role. It is important that the king be legitimate. If the king is illegitimate, this is a tragedy. Now we have two kings on the relief of Karnak. The first is the king of Matkara. The second, the name is written on top, is the king of Menhipara. Matkara is the birth name of Hatshepsut, Pharaoh's wife, who stands here in front of his son Thutmose III, the legal heir. Such a story in Egypt happened more than once, and there were separate conversations about it. I'll just remind you that when a woman reigns, she still portrays herself in a man's appearance, for one simple reason. If a man has K, then a woman has he must. A woman has a different creative energy, and they have different principles and different goals for this energy. And through he must, which is basically a birth energy, K is not transmitted. And accordingly, if K is not transmitted, then the breath of eternal life, which originates from the gods. Therefore, when the statues of Hatshepsut were destroyed, both the monument and the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, they were not destroyed by Hatshepsut, but by the king Matkara. And they destroyed mostly male images, and the female ones remained. It was an attempt to erase the history of the illegitimate king, leaving the wife of God Hatshepsut in those monuments, in those cases when she took her place. Long before Hatshepsut, at the end of the Middle Kingdom, another amazing lady ruled. There are several such names, but the monument is gorgeous. I can't help but show it. This is Louvre. This is Nefersebek. This is one of the women who became a pharaoh. This corresponds to the 18th century before the new era. Let's look at this statue. She has a female breast, a part of a male headscarf, a dress, a royal apron. And here in the centre, I will now highlight this place for you. There are names. I will not read them. I will pay attention to only one detail. The first name, you already know everything about the impressive titulature. The first name, yes, the choir in the palace. Next to the choir, the red arrow shows the hieroglyph T. This is a female genus. The falcon is like this. Then there are two queens, the mane and the cobra. And again, not a goose, but a goose with bread, not a son, but a daughter. If in general terms, inside the titulature, the older names are feminine, and the names of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt are quite masculine. That is, despite the masculine image, you can't deceive the gods. And here, this attempt to get the breath of eternal life and become a legitimate ruler, it was great. Today I have already spoken about the royal women's house, so I will just remind you that around the king and his numerous wives there is a stunning monument which is now being kept in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This is Menkaure, the builder of the third pyramid in Giza, with his wife Hammer-Hanepti II. This masterpiece was made, look how she hugs him. Despite all the canonicity and coldness of the art of the era of the pyramids, this reverence and love is shown here with a gesture. In addition to the great wife of the Tsar, there were a huge number of concubines and young ladies of the royal women's house. The magnificent lid of the vessel for the interior depicts Kiev and the princess Tutuhepu, who came to the Egyptian court and became one of the youngest wives of Akhenaton and his rival Nefertiti, a stunning work by Stravertine at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. A special role, as we already know, was given to the great mother of the Tsar. I show it on purpose, but I think it is a very reverent monument. This is Thutmose IV with his mother, the Queen Tia. They hug each other. And if this is a monument from the Cairo Museum of Sculpture, then on the relief from Karnak again, he and his great beloved mother, very often, as in this case, it happened that in fact the son was not born to the great mother-in-law of the Tsar, but to one of the wives of the Tsar's house. And in this case, and many times more, such parade images of the Queen usually appeared not with her husband, but with her son. With her husband, she was one of them. But it so happened that she gave birth to a son and then received the status of the mother of the heir to the throne. And when he becomes a pharaoh, he depicts his beloved mother in numerous monuments, sometimes in Colossi. And while the great mother of the Tsar is alive, the great wife of the Tsar, forgive me this word, quietly walks along the wall, because there are many evidences when, even from the point of view of insignia and clothes and luxurious clothes, there is, for example, Mutuia, the mother of Ramses II, and the great and beloved Nefertari in a neat Jewish dress, and follows her. In no case do you play the first role. Naturally, the special structure of the palace and the royal house are the royal children. Magnificent, refined, delicate, elegant daughters of Ramses II of Zabidos. Next to each is a signature, a very important title where it's written in the motif of his flesh. She's really a daughter, but in the case of Ramses II, there were 59 officially recognised wives and more than 130 children. But it was rare, to be honest. He was a maximalist in this regard. And then imagine, we have sources, I will briefly mention that, for example, there is a conditionally 59th son. Well, he is not threatened by the royal throne. Moreover, in general, even the juridical positions are disassembled, and the peasants do not allow the king's son to live. There is a story, one of the sons, he went to Phoenicia on the territory of modern Lebanon, and there he is the king's son. He, of course, immediately married the daughter of the richest Phoenician merchant. He became a local large merchant, a shareholder who managed the massive capital, if we can say so, the massive property, to put it more correctly. But he was an Egyptian prince there, because on the Egyptian land there was no position for so many royal children. Well, coming to the ritual part, to the finale, we still have a little time. Be patient. This is an image of Menhotep III during the holiday of Sed, a very important holiday, a big one. Read about it in great literature. A holiday of renewal of vitality. Traditionally, for the first time, it was celebrated in the 30th year of the reign of the king. What is it? It was done very briefly. A statue was made on a statue. The royal fatigue was transferred. Fatigue, health problems, something else. Then this statue was buried in a special tomb. The purified king met the gods who were to be embodied in their statues. And finally, he was presented to an amazing creature. He was called Hedjur, the Great White. This is a tiny pavian albinos, which symbolised all the ancestors of the Egyptian king. He was especially kept in churches. And then a very multi-structural ritual. He was to rule. He was to rule. After the 30th year, you can celebrate as often as you want. And usually if the king wanted to solve some problem, well, plus it's such a pie, a party, and the amount of wine was drunk. Just a giant, judging by the remaining burqa from the wine vessels. This is also such a big holiday for the whole court. Is it possible to depict the old king? Extremely rarely. This is only perhaps the era of Amarna, when the canons of art were exercised at Akhenaton and Nefertiti. The rarest monument in front of you is the British Museum in London. This is a private stela with an image of the old Menhotep III and his old beloved wife, Queen Thea, who came to the court of their son Akhenaton in Amarna to take part in some kind of ceremony. Further, the Egyptian text practically never speaks directly about the king's death. He rose to heaven and became a golden falcon, for the king's heart was tired, and he became a living god, and so on. The combination of the king died cannot be written in the Egyptian language. This is a ritual crime because the king, a priori, is alive. As all the dead, he comes to eternal life. But if we talk about a simple person, it is possible to say that he died, but it is impossible to say to the king that he died. What remains? The memory remains. And here comes a very difficult task, because on the one hand, you want to leave your monuments, such a very human feeling for centuries. And on the other hand, the question arises, have you usurped someone else's monuments? Have you usurped? Because many kings, in order to decorate their own temple, dragged statues of more ancient kings, cut the names, and sometimes slightly changed the face and gave them for their statues. In the Egyptian canon, the statue will belong to the one whose name is not written. And when we see with you, for example, in Medinet Abu, in the huge temple of Ramses III, Ramses III himself, by the way, here's the window of the phenomenon. And he receives a report on the triumphal victory of the troops. And what lies there in a pile is the hands of the cut enemies. Look carefully at the depth of the hieroglyphic text and at the depth of the king's names. They are very different. In order for you to see it in detail, I will show you an enlarged frame. In the king's names in Medinet Abu, you can insert a hand. That is, there are more than 20 centimetres. This is usually done by those kings who actively usurped the monuments of their ancestors. Ramses III was very active in this, and having absolutely perfected this, he tried to secure his name in this way. And the king did not always die by his death. In the period of the pyramids, in the period of Zartete, in the biography of the great husband Una, it is said that he was the only one who was allowed to carry out a secret case against the queen Urudhetis, which as a result aroused the royal guard, which killed Zartete. Ramses III himself, who's now in front of us, did not end very well. Turin, The Egyptian Museum is one of the papyruses that tell about the famous royal conspiracies. I will remind you in a nutshell because this story is well known. His wives rebelled against Ramses III. At first, a woman tried to kill him with sorcery. Sorcery did not work, although they stole a book from the library of Ramesseum, a book of magic spells from the neighbouring temple. Then they bribed the entire guard of the woman's house, made wax figurines, tried with wax figurines, yes, absolutely right, to prompt experienced people in the hall, having pierced them with metal needles. The king also failed. But it turned out differently. When not so long ago the new mummy of Ramses III was investigated, he was attacked apparently when he was walking in some narrow corridor. He was cut off with a very sharp weapon, a big toe, and when he fell, his throat was cut with an obsidian blade so that the spinal column was partially cut from the inside. And this place was when the royal mummy was embalmed. It was not just cut. This cut neck was also embalmed with amulets to somehow restore the integrity of the king. The conspiracy was based on the story of Queen Thea, one of the youngest wives. She wanted to put her son on the throne, whose name we do not know. His text conventionally calls him Pentor. As a result, the conspiracy was revealed. Ramses IV, the lawful heir to the throne, ascended to the throne. The queen and her son were immured alive, as the text says, left alone with themselves. Among the royal mummies in one of the royal caches, a very beautiful, nameless sarcophagus was found. In it was found the body of a very refined young man, about 25 years old, with golden earrings. He was first put on a stake, then still alive. The chisel was removed, wrapped in raw lamb skin to wrinkle, tied, and in the end it turned out like this. This is the famous Pentor, the mummy of the immured prince, from the Cairo Museum. It is confirmed by DNA analysis. It was made in 1911. Yes, indeed, this is the son of Ramses III, and this very refined man died as a result of the conspiracy that led to the death of his father. Like Osiris, Ramses III went to his huge tomb in the Valley of Kings. This is the lid of his sarcophagus. He is like Osiris, Isis, and Nephthys. Isis on the right and Nephthys on the left. Hug him from both sides. The lid is now taken out of the tomb and is kept in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And then there is the Royal Monument. This is what the temple in Mesnet Abu looks like, where the inscriptions of Ramses III are more than 20 centimetres deep. The temple at that time was separated from the tomb itself. The tomb, of course, was in the Valley of Kings. In the temple, the name of the king had to be kept forever. The world of the Egyptian tomb, the royal tomb, is huge. I will show you literally 3 frames. Here is Ramses III, who sucks milk from the breast of a sacred tree from the great sycamore. Sycamore, this type of fig, is really a milk juice. And on this pillar, in his own tomb, he sucks the breast of his mother Isis, and as the accompanying text says, in order to gain immortality. Or like this, Zar-Karemkep is depicted sucking milk of immortality from the name of a cow, an amazing monument which was transported by one of the Roman emperors to Rome and is now kept in the collection of the Archaeological Museum of Florence. Do you remember the very third time? To suck milk, to gain immortality, to conquer death. We have a large number of different royal sculptures. But when I talk about royal masks, I will not show you a stylized, although very beautiful, mask of Tutankhamun. Take a look at the frame, the rarest frame, which is on the right. There is a fragment of a gypsum mass, which was the first in the history of mankind to remove a posthumous mask from the face of Tsar Teti, the very Tsar of the 6th dynasty who was killed by personal guards. The brown mask is a cast made in this completely unique monument, which was found in the pyramid of Teti in Saqqara. In Moscow, in the Museum of Fine Arts of Pushkin, the left monument is kept. This is the mask of Pepe II, the very Tsar who reigned for 98 years. The great sorrow in the museum is without the nearest label, and this is actually one of the oldest preserved royal masks of such a famous ruler. Royal death. The texts, as we said, do not describe, do not depict. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, this is a royal mummy. The mask is already worn on it, and on the far side sits Ba, conditionally the soul, although this is a more multi-dimensional Egyptian concept, a bird with a human head. And on this side sits the golden falcon again, the very golden falcon, the incarnation of which was the Tsar. Well, probably if you remember how many Tsars there were, how many tombs there were, this is a giant world. I will show you just at a few such reference points that this is the tomb of Tsar Jer. This is the first dynasty. This is a closed ecological zone. This is a place which in the late period was revered as a sacred tomb of Osiris. Rituals were held there. Jer is a great sacred ancestor. Just recently the pyramid was opened for guests, for visitors. When you know the whole story will end, you can go to Egypt and see how a 10-metre shaft under the pyramid looks like. The passage is closed with a cork to the central burial chamber. It was there that Jer was once buried. Around the central chamber under the pyramid, there were more than 7 kilometres of underground passages. Giza. We have probably heard about it the most. It was Giza that became the ideal symbol of the royal tomb. The pyramid did not always look like this. On the right, the pyramid of Tsar Senusert the first in Lishti. This is the 20th century before the new era. He was a very successful Tsar, but for the speed of construction, the pyramid was made with a different technology. A stone frame was made, filled with broken brick and covered with a cover. As soon as the cover was removed in later eras, it turned out to be such a home. If you do not show it to the next person, he will never say that this is also an Egyptian pyramid. From the 25th century before the new era, texts appear in the burial chambers of the Egyptian pyramids, great texts of the pyramids, the oldest religious text in the history of mankind, an amazing shot. This is the burial chamber of Zar-Unas. Here, for the first time, they were recorded. More than 750 sermons that were supposed to raise the soul of the Tsar to the world of his ancestors, steal his immortality, allow his soul not to be afraid of death and decay, and raise him to this starry sky with the stars of Aha, the soul of the ancestors covered with the reliefs of the plate and ceiling of the pyramid, so that he could rise there. Another home. And, by the way, the famous Tsar Amenemhet III, one of the greatest Egyptian Tsars. Next to this pyramid in Havar, there was once a labyrinth, a famous tomb, one of the largest in Egypt, which was not fully excavated due to high groundwater. Sometimes nothing saved the pyramids from robbers, because here in Havar, the central burial chamber was made of a single red block of quartz, weighing 110 tons. And on this chamber, with an open top, when the burial was made, with the help of a special mechanism with pouring sand, 3 slabs weighing 45 tons each were lowered. I don't know how many decades they drilled this quartzite But the robbers drilled a hole in the quartzite, climbed inside, and there was not much left from the burial of the Tsar and his daughter Nicobatak. From the 16th century BC, there were already grey tombs, a series of them, in which such amazing sarcophagi of the Tsars were found. This is the 6th sarcophagus in the Louvre. Something was left, but they were too visible. And then the Valley of the Tsars appeared as the last attempt to hide the bodies, to hide the sarcophagi, to protect the tombs from robbers, and at the same time to preserve the sacred meaning. The Great Place, as it was called in antiquity, the Valley of the Tsars, is also a pyramid, only natural. The great top of the West. I will not remind you what was hidden in these tombs, these amazing sarcophagi of Tutankhamun. We all remember. Yes, a huge ritual, huge machines, which had to be necessary to identify the Tsar with Osiris, so that like Osiris, he would gain a new life, gain immortality. Unfortunately, the great Tsar's tombs of the Scythians suffered a lot. Not everything is in such excellent condition as this, but you can look at it forever. These are the tombs of Ramses VI. This is a great legend. Thank you, Serioja. His wonderful shots taken in the Valley of the Tsars. This is a gallery, a book about the secrets of the tomb world, a book about the great remains of this world, a book of heaven, a book of earth, a book of hidden caves. All this is covered. These are the names of the separate texts which cover the walls of the Tsar's tombs in the Scythians. And this is found more often. This is also the Valley of the Tsars, my friends. This is the 40-tomb where the children of princes and princesses, the children of Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, and such a preservation of mummies is fantastic. This nameless, unfortunately torn off the head of some princess which lies here is evidence of the vandalism that the pharaohs were subjected to, despite their sacred status. We took our copper tools and we dug a tomb of the declared Tsar through his most distant room, and we found his underground room. We took the lit lamps in our hands and we went down. We dug a gap which we found at the entrance to his niche, and we found this god lying at the end of his burial chamber. We also found the burial chamber of the Tsar's wife Nubas, his royal wife, in the room below him. It was fortified, protected with plaster, and covered with a gap. We also dug it and found it resting in the same way. We opened the sarcophagus and the coffins in which they were located, and we found the honourable mummy of the Tsar armed with a weapon. There was a large number of amulets and jewels and gold on his neck, and his golden mask was on it. The honourable mummy of the Tsar was completely covered with gold, and his coffins were inside and outside decorated with gold and silver, which we found on the honourable mummy of this god, along with his amulets and jewels that were on his neck and his coffins in which he was resting. And we found the royal wife in exactly the same way. We also collected everything that was found on her. We burned their coffins. We robbed their jewellery, which we found with them, things made of gold, silver and bronze, and we divided them among ourselves. And we distributed the gold that we found on these two gods from their mummies, amulets, jewels and coffins into 8 parts. 20 debans of gold were given to each. 1 deban is approximately 90 kilograms, and there were only 160 debans, not counting the parts of the robbery, and we returned to Kiev. A few days later, the quartermaster heard that we had robbed the city in the west, and he grabbed me and locked me up in the office room of the head of the city. And then I took these 20 debens of gold, which came to me as my part, and I gave them to Haimipet, the sand of the city's harbour, and then they let me go. And I returned to my comrades, and they gave me my part, and I became, together with other robbers, who with me continue to rob the tombs of noble people of the earth to this day. A large number of people of the earth rob them like this, and they are my accomplices. The protocol of interrogation of the tomb robbers in the 12th century before the new era is a story that probably every Egyptian royal tomb. As a result, at the turn of the second and first millennia before the new era, according to the decision of the oracle of the temple of the goddess Mut in Karnak, the tombs were discovered, those that the Jews still remembered then. Unfortunately, during the so-called restoration held in the temple of Ramses III in Medinet, both were robbed again. They were deprived of everything that was given to them in the last way. But nevertheless, the most important thing is the remaining royal bodies. As a result, in this secret tomb, this famous secret tomb, TT 320, Theban tomb 320, in the rocks not far from the temples of Shepsud, Deir el-Bari, 37 bodies were found, princes and princesses, kings and queens. Another secret tomb was found in the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings. This is all the discovery of the end of the 19th century. In such a simple wooden tomb, which, judging by the portrait similarity, once belonged to Horemheb, Ramses the Great himself. His mummy is still kept in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but literally in a few days, all the main royal bodies will be in a special cart, and in the process will be transported to Fastat, to the south of Cairo, to a special museum of mausoleums, the so-called Egyptian mausoleums. This is the National Museum of Egyptian civilization. It is an amazing opportunity to see a person whose face we know so much, Ramses II, his first father, with an amazing piece on his face. Thutmose IV, who died very early, has a very noble face. Look how noble his face is, very well preserved, very graceful, refined, even pierced ears, pierced earlobes. If you look closely, here they are clearly visible. Among the 37 bodies in Deir el-Bari in this cache, TT 320, was found Amenhotep I, the king who ruled in the 16th century before the new era, the king for whom the great mother of the queen Yakhmes Nefertari, the king who was by the ancient Egyptian tradition to be ideal. He fought a little but went on campaigns. The temple was actively rebuilt, recreated Jewish schools. Apparently, he was very loved. That is, he was a kind of a reprimanded person. That is, as far as it's possible, so to speak, about the Pharaoh of antiquity. He was very loved. And further, this is an unprecedented case because the body was decorated with such vivid colours that Gaston Maspero, the great French archaeologist who carved the mummies of the King of Egypt, he did not carve Amenhotep I. He left his portrait and his burial mask when the priests moved all the bodies of the kings and queens, well, part of the bodies of kings and queens, into this secret. It was just a tomb. There was nothing there, not a single image, a cave, in fact. You just saw the footage, and then for one night there were left Amenhotep I and his mother Yakhmes Nefertari, holy benefactors whose strength was enough for the place to become sacred. And only after this consecration and after moving the bodies, think about where the tradition comes from. And the rest of the bodies of the ancestors, those priests who were engaged in these ceremonies. This is what the Holy King we conclude with you the portrait from which my story began, and I thought for a long time about what conclusion to draw from the Egyptian royal authority, what to look at, what else to touch on, and I realised that probably it would be better not mine, but the ancient Egyptian, because gods are gods, rulers are rulers, kings are kings, but there's also a person. These were living earthly people, and several kings who saw during their rule not so much the era of prosperity, but the era of trouble, the era between tribulations, the era when some rulers destroy the monuments and others. They left after themselves such conditional, ethical, political wills. There's absolutely amazing text which is attributed to one of the kings, King Aktoi, and he writes it for his son Merakore, who also must now go to the throne. I follow your ancestors' wise knowledge. Look, words remain recorded. Unfold your scrolls, follow the wisdom, for the one who learns will become skilled. Do not be evil, be kind. Life passes on earth, it is not long. He who leaves a memory of himself flourishes. The righteous lives forever. He who goes with Osiris like a free one. Judges judge, and wise know they are not merciful at the hour when they perform their duties. It is bad when they accuse the wise. Do not hope for long years. They look at life as for 1 hour. Affairs after the death of a person, they put in a pile next to him.